In the remote town of Rookridge, a quiet village nestled between dense woods and towering mountains, strange things had begun to happen. It started with the livestock, sheep and goats found torn apart in the mornings, their carcasses mangled as if by some savage beast. The villagers whispered about wolves, but there was an old legend in Rookridge about something far worse, something that prowled the woods under the full moon. Ezra had heard the stories as a child. His grandmother used to tell him about the Rookridge werewolf, a cursed soul doomed to stalk the woods and feast on blood whenever the moon was at its fullest. But those were just tales meant to scare children into staying inside after dark, or so he thought. Ezra had lived in Rookridge his entire life. At 25, he worked as a blacksmith, his broad frame and strong hands earning him respect among the villagers. He'd never been one for superstitions, but the increasing number of attacks and the eeriness that settled over the village after sunset began to weigh on him. People were growing fearful. Evenings were spent behind bolted doors and shuttered windows. It wasn't just the livestock anymore, people had started disappearing. A farmer, a young woman fetching water, and recently, old Madeline, the village's eccentric healer, had all vanished without a trace. One night, when the moon was full and bright, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside his small cottage, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woods. It felt as if the very air was thick with danger. Unable to sleep, Ezra decided to investigate. He grabbed a lantern, wrapped himself in his cloak, and headed towards the outskirts of the village. The woods loomed dark and silent before him, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. There was no sound except for his footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. As he ventured deeper into the forest, he noticed strange markings on the trees, deep claw marks, as though something large had raked its talons across the bark. His heart began to race, but he pushed forward, curiosity and fear battling inside him. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees. Ezra froze. His grip tightened around the hilt of the knife he tucked into his belt. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, hunched, and covered in coarse fur. Its eyes glowed with a fierce yellow light, and its snout curled into a snarl, revealing sharp, blood-stained teeth. It was a werewolf, just like the stories had described, but there was something different about it. Its eyes. Ezra recognized those eyes. Ezra, a low, guttural voice rasped. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. He knew that voice. It belonged to his friend, Garrick. The two had grown up together, inseparable since childhood, but Garrick had disappeared months ago during a hunting trip, never to return. Now, here he was, twisted into this monstrous form. Garrick, Ezra whispered in disbelief. The werewolf's snarl softened for a moment, its body trembling as if fighting against some internal struggle. But then, with a ferocious howl, it lunged at him. Ezra barely had time to react. He swung his knife wildly, slashing across the beast's arm. It recoiled, blood dripping onto the forest floor. But instead of attacking again, it bolted deeper into the woods. Shaken, Ezra staggered back toward the village. The image of Garrick's monstrous form burned into his mind. He couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the revelation that his friend had become the very thing they'd all feared. Over the next few days, Ezra tried to speak to the village elders, but no one believed him. They dismissed his story as the ramblings of a man too consumed by fear and superstition. But Ezra knew what he saw. He couldn't shake the feeling that the werewolf curse was spreading, that Garrick wasn't the only one afflicted. The full moon was coming again in a few days, and Ezra knew he had to be ready. He started to prepare, sharpening weapons, gathering silver from the villagers to forge into bullets, and most of all, he began watching the people around him more closely. Something had been unleashed in Rookridge, and Ezra suspected it was only the beginning. The werewolf that was once his friend had returned, but what if others in the village were hiding a similar curse? Could he trust anyone anymore? The next full moon would reveal the truth, and Ezra feared that the horrors lurking within Rookridge were far greater than he could ever have imagined. Ezra spent the following days preparing in secret, careful not to let anyone know of his suspicions. He didn't know who could be trusted anymore. If Derek, His childhood friend could be transformed into a monstrous werewolf. Anyone could be hiding the curse. The village was tense, whispers of dark omens spreading through the streets. People stayed indoors at night, but Ezra noticed the nervous glances they cast at each other even during the day. The fear was palpable, an invisible sickness spreading through Rookridge. The night of the next full moon approached quickly, and Ezra's anxiety grew with it. He had forged silver bullets and tipped his knife with silver as well, the only known defense against the werewolves. He spent hours in the woods, practicing with his weapons, preparing for the worst. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Garrick's glowing eyes from his mind. Was there still humanity left in his friend? Could he be saved, or had the curse consumed him completely? The day before the full moon, Ezra noticed something odd. A group of villagers was missing. At first, he thought they might have left to seek safety, but no one had seen them leave. Among them was Rowan, the village hunter who had returned to Rookridge only recently after a long absence. Rowan was known for his skill in the wild and his strange, quiet demeanor. He had been friends with Garrick before he disappeared, and now Ezra couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection. Ezra decided to follow his suspicions, tracking Rowan to a secluded cabin deep in the forest. It was a place Rowan often stayed when hunting, but now it seemed too quiet, too still. As he approached, Ezra heard muffled voices inside. He crept closer, crouching behind a tree, straining to hear. "Tomorrow night, we hunt," Rowan's voice said, rough and cold. "The moon will call to us. We must embrace it." There was a murmur of agreement, and Ezra felt his blood run cold. There were more of them. Rowan wasn't just a hunter, he was leading a pack. They had all been infected, turned into werewolves by the same curse that had claimed Garrick. Ezra clenched his fists, heart pounding in his chest. This was far worse than he had imagined. The village was sitting on the brink of destruction, and no one knew. But what could he do? He was just one man against an entire pack of werewolves. Even with silver bullets and weapons, he couldn't fight them all alone. As he started to retreat, a floorboard creaked inside the cabin, and Ezra caught a glimpse of someone moving to the window. He quickly ducked behind the tree, holding his breath. "Ezra," a voice floated from the shadows. It wasn't Rowan this time. It was softer, more familiar. He dared to peek around the corner and saw a woman standing in the doorway. It was Madeline, old Madeline, the healer who had disappeared weeks ago. But she wasn't old anymore. Her face was youthful, almost radiant, her eyes bright with an unnatural glow. "Ezra," she called again, her voice laced with an eerie calm. "We know you're out there. Come join us. It doesn't have to be like this. We can show you the power of the moon." Ezra froze. Madeline had been turned, just like Garrick, but there was something different about her, something more controlled. She wasn't feral like the others. She smiled, a haunting grin that chilled him to the core. "We are not your enemies," she continued, her voice lilting like a song. "The curse doesn't have to be a curse. It can be a gift, if you let it. You don't have to fight us. You could join us. Think of what we could do, together." For a moment, Ezra felt something tugging at him, a strange pull in his chest, as if her words were burrowing into his mind. But he shook it off, backing away slowly. He knew better than to trust her. Whatever she had become, it wasn't human anymore. "Stay away from me," Ezra growled, raising his knife defensively. Madeline chuckled softly. "You'll come around," she said, almost sweetly. "The moon calls to us all eventually. When you tire of fighting, you'll know where to find us." Without another word, she disappeared back into the cabin, the door creaking shut behind her. Ezra wasted no time in retreating through the woods, heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't go back to the village. Not yet. They wouldn't believe him. And even if they did, there wasn't enough time to prepare them for what was coming. The full moon was only hours away, and soon the forest would be crawling with werewolves. Ezra found himself standing on a ridge overlooking the village, the lights of Rookridge flickering softly in the distance. He felt a deep sense of dread settling over him. How many of the villagers had already been turned? How many more would join Rowan's pack tomorrow night? The curse was spreading faster than he could stop it. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the first slivers of the full moon appeared in the sky, Ezra made a decision. He would fight. but not for the village. They had turned their backs on him, refused to see the danger. He would fight for himself, for the few he could still trust. And as the howls of the werewolves echoed through the night, Ezra knew the battle was only beginning. The curse of the werewolf was no longer just a legend, it was real, and it was growing. But there was one thing Ezra couldn't shake, Madeline's words. The curse didn't have to be a curse. Was there something more to it, something deeper? Could it be controlled, harnessed? As the moonlight bathed the forest in silver, Ezra felt that strange pull again. Perhaps the answer lay not in fighting the curse, but in understanding it. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty, and Ezra could only wonder, would he remain the hunter, or would he one day become the hunted? The moon shone brighter, and somewhere in the distance, a new howl joined the chorus, a voice Ezra feared might soon be his own. The moon hung high in the sky, a radiant orb casting long, twisted shadows through the forest. The howls of the werewolves grew closer, surrounding Ezra from all sides, but he stood his ground on the ridge, breathing heavily, silver-tipped knife clenched in his hand. His mind raced with the weight of all he had learned, the curse, Rowan's pack, Madeline's haunting offer. Was there truth to her words? Could the curse be more than what the legend said? A movement in the trees snapped Ezra back to reality. He spun around, knife raised, expecting an attack. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Garrick, but this time, he wasn't in his monstrous werewolf form. He looked human, his face tired and drawn, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Ezra," Garrick said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's not what you think." Ezra's heart skipped a beat. He took a step forward, his grip on the knife loosening slightly. "Garrick, you're still me?" Garrick finished, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Sometimes, but the curse, it's changing. We're all changing." "What do you mean?" Ezra demanded, his voice thick with confusion. "Is there a way to stop it?" Garrick shook his head slowly, a sad smile on his lips. "No, not stop it, but maybe something else. Something more." Before Ezra could ask more, Rowan stepped into view behind Garrick, flanked by several others from the village. All of them stood calmly, their eyes gleaming with the same eerie glow. Rowan's face was serene, but there was an unmistakable power in his gaze. "You see now, don't you?" Rowan said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "We're not the beasts they say we are. The moon is a gift, Ezra. It gives us power, life beyond what you can imagine. And now it's calling to you." Ezra took a step back, shaking his head. "I'm not like you," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "I'll never be like you." Rowan smiled. "That's what we all said at first. But you feel it, don't you? That pull. The moon. It's already inside you." Ezra's heart raced. The pull he had felt earlier. Was it the curse? Had it already taken root in him, drawing him toward something darker, something beyond his control? He looked at Garrick, whose expression was a mixture of pain and understanding. "Ezra," Garrick said softly, "there's no going back. But you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to fight it." A sudden breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, mingled with something metallic, blood. The howls had grown louder, closer, as if the pack was gathering just beyond the ridge, waiting for the moon to reach its peak. Ezra's mind swirled with doubt. He had come here to fight, to protect the village from the werewolves. But now, faced with his friend, with the strange calm of the others, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Was he really fighting a curse, or was he resisting something inevitable? As if sensing his hesitation, Madeline appeared, stepping out from the shadows with that same haunting smile. She moved toward Ezra, her eyes soft, almost maternal. "The moon chooses who it wants," she said, her voice low and soothing. "You were chosen long before tonight. You can either embrace it, or let it destroy you." Ezra's hands trembled. The knife felt heavier than ever. His instincts told him to fight, to run, but his body seemed frozen, torn between two impossible choices. Suddenly, a howl split the air, this one different, closer, more human. Ezra turned sharply to see another figure emerging from the woods. It was a woman, young and pale, her clothes tattered and stained with blood. Her eyes were wide, wild with fear. She stumbled toward him, clutching her side. "Please, help me," she gasped, her voice desperate. "They're coming." But before she could say more, Rowan stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. She stiffened, eyes darting between Ezra and Rowan, her face a mask of confusion and terror. Rowan smiled gently. It's all right. You're safe now. The moon has called to you too. The woman blinked, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Ezra could see the faint glow in her eyes, the first signs of the change. She was one of them, whether she knew it or not. Ezra felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything was spinning out of control. The lines between right and wrong, between friend and foe, were blurring. What had started as a mission to save the village had turned into something far more complicated. And then, as the moon reached its zenith, Ezra felt it, the sharp pain in his chest, a sudden rush of heat. He staggered, clutching at his heart. The pull had grown stronger, an irresistible force wrapping around his soul. His skin tingled, his muscles tensed, and a low growl rose in his throat, unbidden. Ezra, Madeline whispered, stepping closer. It's time to choose. The moonlight bathed them all in silver, casting long, fiery shadows. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Ezra stood at the brink of something unknown, teetering on the edge of transformation. Would he fight the curse, or would he let it consume him? Would he embrace the power of the moon, or would he become its next victim? Ezra's vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. And as the howls rose once more, he made his choice, though whether it was to embrace the moon or resist it, no one would ever truly know. Because when the moonlight faded, Ezra was gone. And somewhere in the distance, the woods held their secrets, waiting for the next full moon to reveal what he had become.